All right, so as I said, there are a few places where the so-called Cold War is going to turn hot. And one of those places where that happens is in Korea in the 1950s. The Korean War is going to last for about 4 years or so in the 1950s. Now, Korea is a hotspot, I guess you could say, in Asia. Korea was occupied by Japan during the war. They conquered Korea just prior to the Second World War breaking out. After the war, it was divided again into Soviet and American zones. These zones ultimately evolved into two different governments, one communist and one anti-communist, although I wouldn't go so far as to say democratic. However, it was allied with the United States. In June of 1950, a push is made by the communist government of North Korea to invade the South. So in 1950, we get a push all the way down to the South, and in fact, pushing South Korean forces all the way down to this little corner. The initial advance of the North Korean troops happened along this purple line here, where they pushed all the way across there and then down there. South Korean forces were essentially trapped on this little corner. It was done really fast, and it was a total surprise to South Korean forces in 1950 when the war breaks out. This immediately mobilizes a military response from the United States. We saw this as a kind of test of our sort of mettle, our devotion to this ideological conflict that we'd started. Now, the Korean War, while most of the involvement was by the U.S., we provided the majority of troops fighting for South Korea in the Korean War. It was, however, a UN-sanctioned operation. We obtained authorization from the United Nations. The Soviet Union was currently boycotting the Security Council over China, the fact that we wouldn't let China have a seat, or the Chinese government rather take their seat in the United Nations. And so they were not there to veto the UN action in the Korean Peninsula. And so it was officially a UN force that was sent to Korea. It was majority American, ultimately, that went to Korea. The initial American military progress was pretty impressive. So the U.S. arrived in September of 1950 to help the South Koreans, who are all, again, sort of huddled in this little corner of the country. And the commanding officer, which is Douglas MacArthur, who'd been the commanding admiral of the Pacific Fleet who'd been the commanding general in the Pacific during the Second World War, is also going to be the commanding general for American forces, at least initially, in the Korean War. He is going to execute successfully an amphibious landing right here at Incheon, which is right here next to the Korean capital. American forces will make it to the Korean capital, sort of liberating that and pushing all the way up here to this blue line that you see along here. This is a huge victory for UN forces. Initially, the mandate was to reestablish the line that divided North and South Korea. MacArthur had already convinced Truman to overstep that original mandate and take control of North Korea as well, and threaten China, making it all the way to the Yalu River in certain places, here and here in particular. And so that ultimately gets the dander up of the Chinese. In October of 1950, the Chinese thoroughly surprise MacArthur, pouring 3 divisions, nearly 300,000 soldiers total, over the Chinese border into North Korea and pushing UN forces back down all the way to the 38th parallel, which is this line here and beyond, the Chinese making it as far as this point, even past the South Korean capital of Seoul. Following this egregious error, MacArthur is actually removed as the commanding general. He demanded authority to go north again, maybe even to invade China, and maybe even to use nuclear weapons. But Truman ultimately refuses. When MacArthur began publicly criticizing Truman, he was removed from his command. The war ultimately descended into a protracted stalemate, and the death toll was catastrophic. Over 33,000 American soldiers were killed, nearly 1 million Korean soldiers were killed, and nearly 2 million Korean civilians were killed, as well as hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers being killed in the action. The stalemate lasted for nearly 3 years. Truman started to seek a negotiated peace based on the original mandate that we would take back control at the 38th parallel. South Korea and North Korea would remain divided. Most Americans didn't really like this idea of a limited war, and it would ultimately take 3 years and a new president to actually achieve an armistice. An armistice was finally agreed upon in early July of 1953, and the line, which is established here, has remained for, well, all the way until the present day, but it would take a new president to ultimately make that decision as well. So we've mostly been focusing on foreign policy under Truman, but we're going to shift gears a little bit and look at the domestic policies of Harry Truman and see how those play into the predominant ideology of the Cold War as well.